K&F Concept have come out with a new filter kit that could have been made just for me. It wasn't, but it could have been. It has 3 filters, the 3 filters that I use, none of the filters that I don't, and it comes in a nifty little doodad. Now, if I was a filter maker, I would put together a kit, and in that kit would be the filters that I need and none of the filters that I don't need. It would be in a small, secure, padded case that I could carry around with me everywhere. It would consist of an ultraviolet filter, a circular polarizing filter, and then like a 10-stop ND filter. These are the filters that I use. These are the filters that you can't emulate without a whole lot of trouble anyway in Photoshop or Lightroom. I am not a filter maker, so I cannot make this kit. The good news is K&F Concept have, and the kit consists of an ultraviolet filter, as promised, a circular polarizer, and a 10-stop ND filter. They're all magnetic. They're made of optical quality glass and they have multi-layered coatings. So on paper, this looks like a very useful kit, exactly the kind of kit that I would want. And these are not cheap filters. So there are 2 things that we need to do to evaluate these filters. The first is to go out and take pictures with them. And we're going to do that first, and then we'll do a little bit of testing here in the studio. A huge thank you to the people who support me through Patreon or by making a donation through the website. Every little bit counts and it's most gratefully appreciated. Thank you. Before we head out and start using these filters, let me just briefly explain what each of them are. The first filter is the ultraviolet filter. Now, these days, you don't really need an ultraviolet filter because your sensor is not sensitive to ultraviolet energy. And most people who use them to protect the front element of their lens in case of a bump or a drop. I use an ultraviolet filter for some of my macro photography, but only when I'm crawling around on the ground, anywhere that I'm likely to get something on my lens, I'll put a filter on first. The reason is the good filters have a very effective coating, and mud and sap and oil and liquids aren't gonna stay on these filters. They will usually beat up and run off. But bear in mind that anytime you put any filter on a lens, you are adding 2 new interfaces that light has to go through. This is important because unless the refractive index of the material is identical to that of air, which it isn't, you're going to bend the light twice unless it's coming absolutely axial to the filter. Any light entering this filter is going to be bent as it enters the filter and as it leaves the filter. I don't want you to think that putting a filter on doesn't come with some kind of a cost. Personally, I think the softening from a good UV filter is really hard to notice and not worth making a fuss about. Next up is the circular polarizer. This consists of a sandwich of 2 pieces of glass. The front part of a circular polarizer is just a linear polarizing filter, meaning that it can be oriented in such a way that it will block a certain group of wavelengths that are parallel to one another, usually what you would see from reflective surfaces. You can block the reflections while letting the rest of the light through. But linear polarizing filters alone can cause problems for the autofocus on modern cameras. So there is an additional layer of glass on the back of the filter that contains what's called a quarter wave plate, which I'm not going to go into now, but it basically imparts a spiral effect to the light as it comes through the filter, and it overcomes the problems with the autofocus, allowing cameras to autofocus and have the filter on. Usually these will, depending on the orientation you have it at, will either block about a stop of light or two if it's maximally engaged. The reason we use a polarizing filter is to reduce glare. It can give you richer colors, especially in the sky. You get a little bit of a saturation boost. When a filter can do something that I can't do in Lightroom or Photoshop, that's what makes it a necessary filter for me. And the same is true for the last filter in the kit, the third one. And this is a 10-stop ND filter. It could also have been a 6-stop. I carry a 6-stop around with me as well. But there are some things that this filter does that you, again, can't get just by manipulating an image in Photoshop. The way an ND filter works is it just blocks light. It only allows a portion of the light to pass through. And there are several different reasons why you might want to do that. Photographing long exposures when it's bright outside. That's what we'll be doing today, more than likely. It gives us a chance to get some of those lovely effects from slowing down the movement of water or the movement of clouds by allowing you to get a long exposure even though it's sunny outside. I've actually used ND filters when I've been shooting portraits. If I want to get a really, really shallow depth of field because it looks good in the portrait, I have to have my aperture open to 1.6 or 1.4. So obviously, if there's any light outside at all with that kind of aperture, I'm going to get shallow depth of field, but the whole photograph's going to be blown out. So putting an ND filter on that allows you to shoot wide open so you get all the nice bokeh that you want without overexposing the shot. A good ND filter doesn't impart any kind of a color cast, though virtually every one I've ever used does. So we'll see. So that's a little bit of background. They're the things I'm going to be looking for. So let's go out, take some pictures, and then we'll come back and finish up here in the studio.
I had a very good plan this afternoon. None of it's working out very well. This is the only moving water within 100 miles of my house that isn't a sea. So I came over here to do a couple of long exposures to show you how these filters are going to work. But apparently there's a party going on the other side of the lake. That's the pounding rhythms that you can hear. And I can't hear myself think. I'm going to try to get a couple of shots here, then go somewhere quiet to talk to you. First thing I'm going to do is just shoot a bracketed set of regular exposures of this waterfall that you can't see. The dynamic range is so wide today that I had to separate my bracketed shots by multiple stops. So what I'm going to do is use a stack of filters. I'm going to put the circular polarizer on the bottom and then the neutral density filter on top of that using the magnets. And I'll see what we can get in a single shot. Not all of these filters can be applied directly to the lens. For example, the circular polarizer doesn't have a thread, so you can't screw this directly onto the lens. It needs to seat in the magnetic base so that you can turn it, which obviously we're going to do. It's a circular polarizer. So to apply it, now watch, this is very complicated how you do this. You put it on there like that, and it sticks like magic, as if there was a force at play. So what I'm going to do next is add the big stopper. This also applies just the same way that the circular polarizer did. It just clips straight on. As solidly as they hold, the only way I've been able to accidentally knock them off is with the lens hood. Now, most lens hoods on most lenses fit great right over the top of this. All right, we're going to go somewhere quieter and we're going to look at these photographs and see if we can draw any conclusions from what we've done.
In the final output image, I'm very happy with how the filters performed. Again, no vignette, a very slight warming, but the CPL has removed most of the glare from the water, and the sky, which I have miraculously salvaged, was actually not salvaged. That is the sky replacement tool from Photoshop 2021. It is amazing. If you haven't tried it, you really should. After leaving the dam, we went to a few other locations to get a few more test images. This image is actually two superimposed images, both 30-second exposures at 70 millimeters. But on the left, you can see the effect of having the ND1000 in addition to the circular polarizing filter. Without the CPL on the right, you can see how there is much less contrast in the sky. The colors aren't quite as punchy, and there's a lot of reflection off the water. So this particular CPL really does perform very nicely. In this image, I was trying to get a feel for the ND1000 filter without the CPL, and it was later in the day. I don't think the CPL would have been as important, but the end result is very pleasing. The softening of the clouds is fantastic. I see no vignette, and this was shot at 36 millimeters. There was that slight warming I had seen in other photographs too. In looking at this image, you can see how the central portion is more saturated. There's more definition in the clouds, but as you go off to either side, and this was shot at 18 millimeters, you can see that those effects tail off. And this is just a good opportunity for me to tell you about this particular situation that arises with wide-angle lenses and CPLs. So this is my attempt to explain this phenomenon in a drawing. The orange thing is a camera, and the green thing is a CPL. And the yellow ball is the sun. So here's what's happening. When the sun's rays are absolutely perpendicular to the axis of light entering your camera, you're going to get the maximum effect of polarization. You're going to have richer colors, you're going to have sharper contrast, and the clouds will stand out nicely in the sky. By contrast, the light that is much closer to parallel to the light rays, and that would be at the periphery of the image if you were using a wide lens, then the effect is minimized. And you can see in the colored block at the bottom how as you get further away from the axis that's perpendicular to the sun, you get less and less of a polarizing effect. And that's all this really means. If you stick with a lens with a focal length of 24 millimeters or more, you don't usually see much of this effect, but certainly as you get wider, it becomes more of an issue. In the next two images, I want to show you the difference that the CPL can make when you reorient the polarization of the filter. In the first image, the effect is fairly minimal, and with a 90-degree rotation of the CPL, you can see how dramatic the effects of this particular filter are. While I was using a circular polarizer in this photograph, that's not the reason I'm showing it to you. I'm showing it to you because of the look on this pelican's face. Priceless. Let me just quickly explain why you get vignetting when you use a circular polarizer with a wide-angle lens. So the way to understand this is the red dotted lines are the field of view on a 16 millimeter lens, say, whereas the blue lines are the field of view on a 30 millimeter lens. So as you can see, with a very wide angle lens, the height of the filter itself becomes relevant, because once it crosses the line that the light is coming into your lens on, you're going to get vignetting, and that's really all there is to it. This is proof that I do in fact take pictures of flowers every now and again. All right, that's enough of that. So with the practical portion of the testing out of the way, I was satisfied that these were high quality filters. I didn't see any evidence of vignetting that I wouldn't have seen with any other filter. There was definitely no softening with any of the filters in place. By the end of the day, I was pretty convinced that the amount of color cast that the ND1000 filter was leaving was very, very subtle. Half the time I couldn't even see it. Who would have thought that something as simple as putting magnets in a filter holder would make it so much easier to use? The company recommends that you do one of two things. You either start with your UV filter and then add your circular polarizer and your ND. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. If I've got a circular polarizer and I've got an ND filter, I don't need a UV filter underneath it. So the second way that they recommend these things being used is to just use the magnetic ring that comes with the filters, put that on the camera and forget about it. It is so small and narrow, it doesn't cause any problems with vignetting, doesn't cause any problems with anything. I keep forgetting that's where it is. It just fits very comfortably on the end of the lens, and that way when I get ready to want to add a filter like this circular polarizer, all I have to do is... What's the difference then between a good filter and a bad filter? The quality of many filters can be described by the quality of their coatings. Really high quality coatings are applied in layers. They're applied by a condensation process when a vapor made up of this stronger than glass material is deposited in layers onto the underlying filter glass. The glass itself has to be of very high quality. It has to be clear without inclusions. The surfaces have to be completely flat, as any irregularity in the surface is likely to increase internal reflections. And that's really what we're trying to avoid. The coatings also have to be of sufficient quality to allow dirt and oil and water to bead and run directly off them without leaving behind any kind of a smear or anything else that's going to diffract the light. Good filters that have good coatings are going to be much less likely to produce reflections. Now, external reflections, reflections off the front of a filter, are not that important. But what's really important is that it prevents internal reflections. That's reflections from the glass that are directed back down into the lens. That's the kind of reflections that will ruin the images, with haziness, a flare. There's all kinds of manifestations of light that's reflected into the camera, but good coatings can prevent that. Arguably, the most important feature of a good filter is that it has no color cast. By that I mean, when you put the filter on your lens and take a photograph, you will not be able to distinguish the difference between with and without a filter, except maybe in terms of exposure, which of course would be the purpose if you were using an ND filter. Inexpensive filters are housed in a ring of aluminum, and while they're light and they can be very low profile, they can be quite rigid, they also have a really bad tendency to grip and to actually get so seated into the thread that you can't budge them, and that can be really problematic. So the best filters have a brass material. Actually, the brass material is called brass. There's a coincidence for you. Brass rings don't bind like aluminum do. So I have a bunch of test shots now that I think are gonna pretty much tell the story of how these filters work out in the wild, but I still want to go back to the studio and shoot a bunch of test shots in the studio under controlled conditions so that I can get a very good idea about whether or not these things are leaving a color cast.
Sometimes you have to look close to see it, but that's what we're going to do.
Some of the photographs did look a little warm to me when we used this 10-stop filter. But let's actually measure it, take some photographs indoors, control the light, and see exactly what kind of color cast this is leaving. So I set up a color checker card and a lens calibration card on a white background using identical lighting. The camera's white balance set to 6150. I took a photograph of the test platform, then I put on the 10-stop filter, adjusted only the shutter speed in order to get a similar exposure, and then took a second photograph of the test platform. Now, when we go into Lightroom, I have the two photographs right here. The first is with no filter. The second image is with the 10-stop filter, and you can see that this was now shot at 5 seconds, whereas the original photograph was shot at 1/400th of a second. That is consistent with adding the 10-stop filter. So all we have to do is take the second image and compare it to the first, like so, and you can immediately see that there appears to be an orange cast. Now, if we wanted to know exactly how much of a color cast there is, all we would have to do would be go back into the regular mode. So this is the first image out of camera. This was exactly how it was shot. Now, if we correct the white balance by taking the white balance eyedropper tool, let's put it on this mid-gray tone, click on it, and we can see that it has corrected our white balance only very slightly. So this is now white balanced in Lightroom. What we can do now is copy that change that was made to this image by going to Develop Settings, Copy Settings, and then make sure that only white balance is checked in our settings, then hit Copy. Now, if we go to our second image, this is with the ND filter in place, we can apply that same white balance correction by right-clicking, going to Develop Settings and Paste Settings. All that does is apply exactly the same correction that we did to the first photo, the one without the filter. And as you can see, it has applied exactly that change. Now, this still looks a little warm, as you would expect if the filter was causing warming. If we now correct this white balance at exactly the same spot on the color checker card, now it's white balanced, and if we compare it to the other photograph, they should look the same. They are identically white balanced. But in order to white balance the second image, we have had to apply an additional 300 Kelvin to the cool side, meaning that the original photograph was 300 Kelvin warmer than the photograph with no filter. So going back to the original images, we can see that without the ND filter and with the ND filter resulted in an image that was 300 Kelvin warmer as a result of the filter. I got the distinct impression that once we get to stacking at least 3 of these elements together, we start to see vignetting, especially at shorter focal lengths. It didn't make it to 16 like the paperwork said. I was getting some vignetting at 24. So we'll do a slightly more controlled test here in the studio and see just exactly where the vignetting appears. Testing for vignetting consisted of taking a lot of photographs of a white wall. I used lenses of focal lengths between 16 and 24. There was no vignetting at focal lengths over 24 millimeters. The only way I was able to demonstrate vignetting at 24 millimeters was to put the magnetic ring, UV filter, CPL, and ND filter all on at the same time, which would be a situation that would never arise in actual practice. At 16 millimeters, there was vignetting with any of the thicker combinations that I used. I could use a single element on the magnetic ring and not have visible vignetting, but as soon as I added a third element, vignetting would appear. I would not recommend using both the CPL and the ND filter with either of these bases on the 16mm lens. Let me wrap it up by saying this. K&F Concept is clearly in the process of breaking free from the pack. They are making some very competitive, high-quality photographic equipment, and these filters are the best example of that I have yet seen. These are beautifully made of good materials. They do exactly what they're supposed to do. They don't have any fatal flaws. There are things I like and there are things I don't, and I'll run through them really quickly. The things I like are the magnetic mounting system, the padded case to put them in, the fact that I can buy the 3 filters that I need and not have to buy anything else, the fact that they're made of real optical glass. They're thin, they're hard, and they have great coatings on them. No sign of internal reflections, even down to the tactile bumps on the outside of the filter. I suppose that there are 3 things that I would consider negatives or cons. The first is the color cast, but like I've said, that's minor. It's consistent with most of the other competitors' filters, so I'm not too bothered by that. The second is the fact that you can't use a lens hood on a lot of your lenses, especially the higher end lenses that have the heavy lens hoods. Probably my biggest gripe is my third issue, and that is the fact that the mounting ring and the UV filter have aluminum threads. They bind on lenses and they need a wrench to get them off. They're expensive enough that they should probably be using brass. But I have other expensive filters that also use aluminum and they also bind, so maybe I just need to get over it. So that's it. I think they're great filters at a great price. If you want to get those discounts I was talking about, you'll find the links down below in the show notes. Just click on one of those. If you want to see the test photographs and some I didn't show in the video, you can find those in the article over on my website. I'll also link that in the show notes. I'll be back in a few days with something else. So until then, take care and stay safe. I'll see you again soon. Goodbye.